So just for our viewers, we're discussing here the question mentioned yesterday about someone who intentionally puts out the menorah. And we argued yesterday, we weren't sure, and we argued that considering that the mitzvah is technically done at the moment of lighting, then putting it out shouldn't make a difference. And that's indeed one view. And then, which would mean you would relight it because that's a respectful thing to do, but there's no blessing to be made because you already fulfilled the mitzvah. Or, other option is because you intentionally undid it, you undid your act retroactively, as it were. That's the other view. And both are brought down in the Mishnah Berurah.
Mishnah speaks one though, but other opinions.
He quotes in the Pri Megadim not to relight,
right.
And I guess others would disagree.
Yeah.
Okay, Shkayach, that's a good question, and thank you.
Very good question. It's discussed in detail in the Yaakov Yosef. He goes through all
Yaakov Yosef, he would have all the sources, yeah.
Yeah, he goes through all the sources. It's not really conclusive. It's not like a rishon. It's the Achronim debate back and forth, so he can argue either way. But I thought it was a very interesting question.
All right, a good Chodesh, everybody. Chodesh Tov, happy Chanukah. We finished a little late because it's Shesh Chodesh, but of course, the Potter Blei Klum E Efsher, we cannot get away with learning nothing, especially on Chanukah, where we thank Hashem for defending us against those who would make us forget His Torah. So certainly we can't diminish in our Torah learning just because it's a longer davening. Okay. We're in Chav Beis Amud Aleph, 22a. And I apologize to our viewers, you don't have the text on the screen. Not today. We'll make sure we have that tomorrow. And what we're discussing here is two issues that come together, which is, number one, how does an object retain its holiness, and to what degree does an object retain its holiness in terms of it being used for a mitzvah? We used yesterday two examples. Well, actually, we covered four examples, two from the Gemara and then two that we introduced. One example, let's put Chanukah aside for a moment. We used the example of the lulav, which after the Yom Tov is during the Yom Tov, it's an actual mitzvah during the Yom Tov, and therefore has all that holiness and has to be treated with a certain respect. And then once Yom Tov is over, once the 7 days of Chanukah, Sukkot are over, it can be discarded, but should be done so respectfully because, hey, a mitzvah was done. That was one example. The other example we use on the other extreme is tefillin. The object itself is imbued with a sense of holiness. Then the two examples the Gemara mentioned is our initial case, the Chanukah menorah, which is what we're trying to determine what's its status. And we determined that the light itself isn't a mitzvah, because the mitzvah is the act of lighting. But nonetheless, considering that it is an object with which you did a mitzvah, and therefore there shouldn't be a bizu, there shouldn't be any disrespect. And this we derived from, and this is our fourth example, is the blood that one has to cover after ritual slaughtering, after shechita. One covers the blood as part of the mitzvah. So even though obviously the blood has no holiness, nonetheless the halacha is one cannot kick the dirt to cover it. One should use their hand as a sense of respect. So that's where we are, and the Gemara is now going to introduce another such scenario, in some ways even less than the lulav itself, as we shall see. So this is the lowest bar. Till now, we've gone between, let's say the lowest is the blood / the oil, which themselves aren't the mitzvah, but their mitzvah was done with it, and therefore to be respectful. A little above that is the lulav, which throughout the 7 days is a mitzvah, and then the tefillin, which itself are holy period always, once it's been established as an object for a mitzvah. Meaning not while it's leather and a hide, obviously. When exactly that happens is a good question, whether intention, whether it has to be done a mitzvah done, it's a separate story. Meaning at what point does the leather hide go from an object of leather hide to an object of mitzvah? That's a separate discussion which we'll leave away for now. But now the Gemara is going to introduce an even lower rung, in which there is some sort of holiness to it, but not really, because it's not the mitzvah itself, as we shall see. So then the line begins, it's about halfway through the page, the line begins with the word alav, and the second word, there's a colon, and then the second word is ba'ominei. Ba'ominei, Rabbi Shua ben Levi. The following inquiry was presented before Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Rabbi Shua son of Levi. Mahu, what is the law? Listapik, to make use of noi sukkah. Noi sukkah is ornaments that one puts in their sukkah to make it look nice. So it's not part of the mitzvah itself, because if it were not there, the mitzvah would still be fulfilled. So it isn't the object of the mitzvah. So certainly, if the lulav itself, as we discussed yesterday, after Sukkot is over, can be thrown out respectfully, then certainly once Sukkot is over, these ornaments have no holiness, because it isn't an object of the mitzvah itself. But Kol Shiva, what about through the 7 days of Sukkot? Through these 7 days, it isn't the mitzvah, but it's been designated as an ornament to the mitzvah. It's been designated to service the mitzvah. And therefore, may I make use of those things in the middle of Sukkot. If I hang if I'm hanging a curtain or some sort of drapery to make the sukkah beautiful, and then I decide I want to take it into my house to cover the window, can I do that? In the middle of Sukkot. Following? Okay. Says the Gemara, Amar Le, so Rabbi Shimon Levi responds, they present this inquiry. He said, Hare Amru, we've been taught, and this is what we learned yesterday, one cannot count money using the light of the menorah, the Chanukah menorah. Because the Chanukah menorah, even though itself is not an object of a mitzvah, because the mitzvah was already done earlier, nonetheless, out of respect for the mitzvah, we don't count the money. So says Rabbi Shimon Levi, the same should be the case with the ornaments of the sukkah. Even though it's not the mitzvah itself, but because the mitzvah is it's augmenting the mitzvah, therefore one cannot use it for personal use, at least while the days of sukkah are lasting, while the mitzvah is being done. Yeah, this is Rabbi Shimon Levi's response. So he's putting it at the same level as the Chanukah menorah / the blood that's being covered after shechita, after the ritual slaughter. Amar Rav Yosef said, I imagine he was there, or maybe he's commenting later, says, Mored Avram, God of Abraham. This is an ancient way of saying, oh Lord, what are you saying? But the way they would say is, Mored Avram, Master of Abraham, what are you saying?
Master of us.
Sorry?
Master of us.
It's an expressionism. Like I say, oh Lord, what are you thinking? So the way they say it then was, Mored Avram, Master of Abraham, what are you saying? Like, how could you say such a thing? Tali Tana, but Loi Tanya. You are deriving a law which is actually stated explicitly in the Mishnah and deriving it from something that's not explicitly stated in the Mishnah. The law we learned yesterday about not counting money in front of the Chanukah menorah is not from the Mishnah. That came from, who was it? Ravasi, Ravasi, which is way after the Mishnah. It's in the Gemara's age. And in Amora, from the post-Gemara age. And now, you're deriving from that a law which actually is stated explicitly in the Mishnaic age text. As he says, Sukkah Tanya, the law of the ornaments in the Sukkah Tanya has been stated explicitly in the Mishnaic age text. Chanukah, the law of the menorah, that you said you're not allowed to count money in front of the menorah, Loi Tanya, was not explicitly stated in the Mishnaic age text. So why would you derive the law of Sukkah, which is stated explicitly in the Mishnah, or Mishnaic age text, from the Chanukah menorah, which is not explicitly stated in the Mishnaic age text? And the Tanya, for we learned, if one covered his chach as it's supposed to be kosher, so he got a kosher sukkah. And now he crowned it or adorned it with draperies, visadinin, and like sheets, hamitziyorin that have all kinds of images on them. The talaba goizim, and he hung nuts, apresikin, and he hung peaches, shkedim, he hung almonds, rimonim, he hung pomegranates, uparlicha, and oven, and he hung clusters of grapes. V'itros shal shibolim, and he hang wheat stalks, yenei shashmanim, and I guess clusters, or I'm not sure how grapes grow, olives grow, but some sort of hanging olives, the saltes, and could be in like a bag or something, or kind of basket.
Wine and oil, liquids.
Yeah, the saltes, and he hung bags of flour. Basically, people used to hang, or people still do, hang all kinds of foods related to Israel, related to the temple. So they're hanging oil, olives, wheat, pomegranates, or just nuts because they're beautiful and they smell nice. I guess peaches are also good looking and they smell nice. So he's hanging them in the sukkah. Says the Mishnaic age text, one cannot make use of them until after the last day of Sukkot, till after Yom Tov is over, till after Shmini Atzeres. It means even though Shmini Atzeres, Simchas Torah, is not part of Sukkot, you still can't enjoy it then because it's muktzah. It's muktzah. We're going to explain why in a moment, why it's muktzah. Right? So here we have Mishnah. The point is, before we go further, we have a Mishnaic age text which explicitly states that you're not allowed to enjoy of the Sukkot ornaments so long as Sukkot lasts. So you, Rabbi Shimon Levi, you cannot make personal use of it. You couldn't take it and use it as a napkin. You couldn't take it and eat it even in the sukkah.
He's asking, let's say you hang a bunch of grapes on yours.
And you take it to eat it in the sukkah?
No. But then you have other grapes in your house and you start eating those.
Yeah, of course you can take those.
Yeah.
No.
You mean if you could take it down and eat it in the sukkah?
Just enjoy them for the sukkah purpose, not something.
In what sense? That you're sitting in its presence, or that you're actually taking it and eating it? So you couldn't take down the drapery and cover the window. You couldn't take that and eat it. It's left there. It's the only enjoyment you're allowed to have is the fact that it's in your sukkah. That's it. Right? Because your use of it is the mitzvah use of it, not your personal use of it. Right? So here, this is this makes the point already that Rabbi Yosef was trying to make. Rabbi Shimon Levi, you are telling us that I can't use the ornaments of the sukkah, comparing it to menorah. Here I have a Mishnaic H text that says so explicitly, whereas the menorah case was only quoted by Rav Asi, and therefore you're deriving the wrong law from the wrong law. Following?
Kind of begs the question, why would he say that Gemara H text?
That's what Rav Yosef is challenging.
You go directly to the...
That's precisely what Rav Yosef is challenging. Why are you quoting Mishnaic H text why are you quoting an Amora post Mishnaic H text when you have a Mishnaic H text says it explicitly? Okay, but here we have another detail which actually gives it a different status a little bit, and this will help us understand a little bit. Which because the concluding line of that Mishnaic H text is, im hisnalen, if you made a condition upon them, hakol lefi tnoi, everything follows the condition. What he's talking about, what he's saying is as follows: the reason why those ornaments are not to be used throughout Sukkot is not because they themselves are the object of a mitzvah, or because they have some holiness. They're not. If you didn't have them in your sukkah would be kosher. Right? If you didn't have the oil in your menorah would not be kosher. Even though the menorah itself is not the mitzvah is the lighting of the menorah, and therefore once the lighting is done, the mitzvah is no longer there. But the oil at least is servicing the actual mitzvah itself, and the same thing is true of the schach, and the same thing is true of the lulav, and the same thing is true of the blood. The blood itself is servicing the actual mitzvah, whereas the ornaments are not servicing the mitzvah. If you don't have them, the mitzvah is done anyway. The only thing it does is it makes it nicer, makes it beautiful. So why is it that I can't use it? The reason I can't use it is because at the moment Sukkah started, if in my mind, not consciously, but in my the way I was thinking about these things these are dedicated to make the Sukkah beautiful. This is what's called muktzah. The word muktzah, which we just talk about, which we use for Shabbos for things you're not allowed to touch, it's not really a correct use of the term. Over there, the term should be used there is isser tiltul, the isser tiltul, the prohibition against moving objects when you don't need them. Muktzah is a specific type of isser tiltul. Muktzah is a specific kind of things you're not allowed to touch on Shabbos. Namely, those are the kinds of things at the moment Shabbos started, they were muktzah. Muktzah means set aside. They are set aside from your mind. The moment Shabbos started, you did not have any intention of using that item because you couldn't use that item. And therefore, when Shabbos comes, you can't use it because at the moment the Shabbos began, it was set out of your mind. And the same thing is true of these ornaments. The moment Sukkah started, in your mind, these things were staying. They're all Sukkahs. So they have been set aside in your mind to dedicate it to the mitzvah. But not because they themselves are part of the mitzvah. It's all because of what's happening in your mind. And therefore, if at the moment the Sukkah started, when you were lighting Shabbos candles, or whoever it was, your wife's lighting Shabbos candles, the moment Sukkah started, you said to yourself, I'm indeed dedicating these things for the use of the Sukkah, but I may want them, and when I want them, I'm going to take them. So I've just diminished its exclusivity to the mitzvah. And therefore, in that case, I could take it down and use it on Sukkot. So that's why I said this is a level lower. Because it itself is not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is not being done with these items. It's only that in my mind, they were dedicated to the mitzvah. And because in my mind they're dedicated to the mitzvah, so long as the mitzvah lasts, I can't take them.
So just like books on Shabbos, if you have in mind that you need to use that item,
Then you could. It depends on what kinds. It's not so simple.
No, I mean, depending on what kind.
Yeah. Most of these things happen automatically. It's very rare where you can undo a muktzah on Shabbos. But over here you can, because the whole thing came from your mind. Because in other words, these same grapes, if they were in my drawer, I'm allowed to use them on Sukkot. Now they're hanging on the roof of a schach, now I can't take them on Yom Tov. Right? The whole thing happened because of an act I did. Right? Where on Shabbos, most of the items that are muktzah are the types of items that you can't make use of on Shabbos, and therefore they're set aside. In most cases, not always, but in most cases. So there are cases where you could undo it in your mind, but let's put that aside for right now, because it's a complicated set of laws. The laws of tiltul and muktzah on Shabbos are very, very detailed, nuanced, and complicated, so we're going to put a pin in that. But just for the purpose of our conversation here, because the entire reason I'm not allowed to make use of these things that adorn the sukkah is because I have dedicated them to adorn the sukkah. Therefore, if I make a condition that I'm going to adorn it, I'm going to adorn the sukkah with it, but I'm going to take it when I need it, then I can.
Because it's not an object of the mitzvah.
Correct. It all comes down to what I had in my mind, which is why the prohibition of using those things extend even to the last day of Sukkot, which is no longer Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah. Because at the moment Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah began, they were set for the Sukkah. Therefore, that muktzah effect lasts the whole Yom Tov. even though it's no longer adorning a mitzvah, because the mitzvah is over. Because the moment Simchas Torah started, I didn't have the option to use it. It was still set for the sukkah, right? Which means now we have a level lower, right? So we have the highest. Let's go from top to bottom. You have the highest level, which is tefillin. It itself becomes the object of mitzvah. You have under that, you have the lulav, which is a mitzvah so long as it's being used for a mitzvah for the 7 days of Sukkot. Afterwards, it's no longer an object of a mitzvah and can be thrown out respectfully. Level lower is menorah and blood, the blood of that's being covered, where it's not an object of a mitzvah, but a mitzvah is being done through that object. Right? The candle, the mitzvah itself is lighting, and I happen to be lighting this candle. Right? The mitzvah is to cover the blood, and I happen to be covering this blood, but the blood itself and the candle itself is not the object of the mitzvah, like tefillin or like lulav even. And one level lower than that is items that themselves aren't the mitzvah, but I have so dedicated them that they're going to adorn the mitzvah. It's similar to a tefillin bag, which also has a certain level of holiness, because I have dedicated this bag to behold my tefillin. Similar to these adornments that have been dedicated in my mind to adorn the sukkah, and therefore, because if I make the condition that I'm not using them, that I'm going to use them on sukkahs, I may. Okay, concluding words, I should say. So Rav Yosef successfully proves that the prohibition against using these dedicated items to adorn the sukkah is a Mishnaic age text, and therefore don't quote that. Don't quote Chanukah as your proof. So where is the root source of the law of Chanukah? Where is the root source of this idea that things with which you do a mitzvah have to be done respectfully? Elam Rav Yosef says, Avuhan dekula, the father of all of these is dam, is blood. Because as we mentioned before, that's derived from a verse. Where the verse says, V'shafach v'kasa, you drew blood and you cover blood. And we derive from that to mean the same part of your body you use to draw blood, namely your hand, is the same part of your body you should use to cover the earth, to cover the blood with earth, namely your hand. And we derive that respectability from the verse itself, and therefore that becomes like the father of all other versions of how to be respectful with objects of mitzvah on whatever level we described before.
The same goes with the talus.
Well, so talus is interesting. We're going to talk about that. Okay, we'll talk about that tomorrow, a little bit at least, because the talus is different. Because there's, let's put the talus aside for a second, because the talus has been dedicated as an object for your prayer. But let's say my tzitzit that I'm wearing under my shirt, right? It's not dedicated for a mitzvah necessarily. It's an article of clothing I'm wearing. The mitzvah is actually the strings that hang on it, not the actual cloth. So that itself is discussed in halacha. Whether after it's no longer kosher, may I use the cloth for something else? That's a separate discussion, which will come up a little bit. We'll get into, God willing, tomorrow. But that's a very good example. So you have to look at now that you have all these categories, you have to look at every mitzvah and say, okay, what kind of mitzvah is it? Is it in the object or is it in the act? And then you have to think to myself, is this object the actual mitzvah, or am I just using the mitzvah with it? Is it adorning the mitzvah? Is it servicing the mitzvah? You have to think of all these different, all these different categories and see classifications and see which mitzvah and which object falls into which classification. And they're very nuanced and very detailed, and many of them. And this is discussed in, I don't know how many hundreds of pages, thousands of pages. Okay, have a wonderful day. Happy Chanukah and a good Rosh Chodesh. Chodesh Tov, everybody.